May 1, 1943. A B-17 flying fortress is disintegrating at 20,000 feet. Cannon shells have torn open the fuselage. A wall of fire is eating the radio compartment alive. Spare rounds are detonating in every direction. 3 men have already jumped for their lives. 2 more are bleeding on the floor. The pilots are sealed behind a curtain of flame. They cannot move. They cannot help. The only person left in that burning middle section is a 32-year-old staff sergeant, 5 feet 6, 130 pounds, who nobody at the base wanted anywhere near their aircraft. His name is Maynard Smith. His crew called him Snuffy. Today is his very first combat mission. What he does in the next 90 minutes will make him the first enlisted airman in United States history to receive the Medal of Honor. But when the Secretary of War arrived to pin that medal on his chest, they had to search the entire base to find him. He was in the kitchen, peeling potatoes. Punishment for being late. This is his story. Maynard Harrison Smith was born in 1911 in a small Michigan town. His father was a successful lawyer. His mother taught school. By the standards of rural America, the Smiths were comfortable, and Maynard made sure everyone around him knew it. From childhood, he had a talent for making enemies. He was sent to a military boarding academy in Indiana to straighten him out. It didn't take. He drifted through a string of government jobs, got married in 1929, divorced by 1932. When his father died in 1934, Maynard did something that tells you everything you need to know about him. He quit working entirely and lived off the inheritance. A man in his 30s, coasting on a dead man's money, certain he was smarter than everyone he met. The money eventually ran out. Then came the court case. By 1942, Smith had stopped paying child support. A judge looked across the bench at this unemployed, arrogant 31-year-old man and gave him a choice: jail or the military. Maynard Smith chose the military, not out of patriotism, not to fight the Nazis, because it beat prison. He enlisted in the Army Air Forces on August 31, 1942. The Army Air Forces needed aerial gunners. The bombing campaign over occupied Europe was consuming air crews at a horrific pace. Gunners earned automatic promotions to non-commissioned officer rank, better pay. Snuffy Smith volunteered for gunnery school, for the paycheck. After training, Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith was shipped to England and assigned to the 423rd Bombardment Squadron, 306th Bomb Group at RAF Thurleigh in Bedfordshire. His reputation arrived before he did. Within days, Smith had managed to antagonize almost the entire base. He was insubordinate, abrasive, and utterly convinced of his own superiority, despite having flown 0 combat missions. The other men started calling him Snuffy, after a lazy, cantankerous comic strip character. The name fit perfectly. Replacement gunners were normally assigned to a crew within days of arrival. Combat losses were so high that experienced crews were desperate for new men. Nobody would take Snuffy Smith. For 6 weeks, he sat on the ground while everyone around him flew. Crews preferred flying one man short over flying with him. But eventually, war runs out of patience for personal preferences. April 30th, 1943. The mission board went up. Target: the German submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire, France. Saint-Nazaire was one of the most savagely defended targets in occupied Europe. American crews had a name for it: Flak City. The anti-aircraft fire over that port was so thick and so accurate, it had broken better men than Snuffy Smith. Smith was assigned to fly as ball turret gunner. The Sperry ball turret was a glass and steel sphere bolted to the belly of the aircraft. The gunner sat curled inside it, knees at his chest, 2 50 caliber machine guns at his fingertips, suspended in open air 20,000 feet above the ocean. It was the most exposed position on the plane. It was also designed for small men. At 5'6" and 130 pounds, Maynard Smith fit the specifications exactly. The pilot was First Lieutenant Lewis Johnson. This was his 25th mission. the final flight of his combat tour. After today, he was going home. The rest of the crew were experienced veterans. Smith was the only rookie on board. At 3 in the morning on May 1st, the crews were woken for their briefing. The skies were overcast, the runway wet. The mission was a go. 78 B-17s lifted off into the gray English dawn and pointed south toward France. The bomb run over Saint-Nazaire went better than expected. Minimal resistance. They dropped their loads and banked for home. 2 hours later, as the formation descended through heavy cloud, the lead navigator made a fatal error. He thought he was looking at the English coast. He was looking at Brest, a heavily fortified German naval base on the far western tip of France. The formation dropped to 2,000 feet, right into the guns. German anti-aircraft batteries opened fire from below. Fighters scrambled from nearby airfields. Within 60 seconds, the sky was full of explosions and burning aircraft. Lieutenant Johnson's B-17 caught the worst of it. 20-millimeter cannon shells punched through the fuselage. Fuel lines ruptured. A fire exploded in the radio compartment and began tearing toward the waist section. Oxygen lines shredded. Control cables snapped. Down in the ball turret, Snuffy Smith lost power. The turret locked. He was trapped in a useless glass bubble bolted to the underside of a burning airplane. He had to get out. Smith cranked the manual hatch open and pulled himself up into the fuselage. What he found was a vision of hell. Fire was rolling through the radio compartment. Smoke was so dense he could barely see 3 feet. Spare ammunition was cooking off in the heat, rounds detonating in random bursts, shrapnel ricocheting off the aluminum walls. 3 crewmen, Technical Sergeant Henry Bean, Staff Sergeant Robert Folliard, and Staff Sergeant Joseph Bukacek, had already made their decision. They jumped. All 3 were lost. The tail gunner, Sergeant Roy Gibson, was alive but badly wounded. He couldn't move. Up front, Lieutenant Johnson and his co-pilot were sealed in the cockpit behind a wall of fire. They had no communication with the rear of the aircraft. They didn't know who, if anyone, was still back there. Standing between the fire and the wounded man, the only able-bodied person in the entire rear section of the aircraft, was Maynard Smith, the man nobody wanted to fly with. 90 minutes. He did not freeze. He did not bail out. He went to work. First, Gibson. Smith crawled to the tail gunner, applied first aid, bandaged the wounds as best he could, and made certain the man was stable enough to survive the flight. Then he turned to the fire. The flames were advancing toward the fuel tanks. If they reached them, the aircraft would cease to exist. Smith grabbed a fire extinguisher and attacked. When that one ran dry, he grabbed another. When the extinguishers were gone, he tore off his flight jacket and beat at the flames with the fabric. He wrapped himself in anything he could find, clothing, blankets, and went at the fire with his bare hands. When nothing else worked, he used the only thing he had left. He urinated on the flames. Whatever it takes. Then the German fighters arrived. FW-190s spotted the crippled, smoking B-17 falling behind the formation. Easy kill. Smith ran to the left waist gun and opened fire. Then he sprinted to the right waist gun and fired from there. Then back to the fire. Then back to the guns. For 90 minutes, he fought on 3 fronts simultaneously: the flames, the fighters, and the wounded man who needed him to stay alive long enough to keep treating him. The heat inside the fuselage became unbearable. When the spare ammunition began cooking off in its boxes, Smith grabbed them and hurled them through the burn holes in the fuselage, lightening the aircraft, buying more time. In the cockpit, Lieutenant Johnson had no idea what was happening behind him. He only knew one thing: his aircraft was still flying. He nursed the battered B-17 across the English Channel with severed cables, failing hydraulics, and controls that barely responded. Every minute felt like an hour. Finally, the English coastline appeared below. Johnson spotted an airfield at Predannock on the southwestern tip of Cornwall and lined up for an emergency landing. The wheels touched the runway, and then the fuselage split in half. Weakened by fire and riddled with over 3,500 holes and shrapnel impacts, the aircraft simply came apart on the tarmac. When the rescue crews reached the wreckage, they found Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith standing in the debris, exhausted, scorched, but alive. So was the tail gunner he'd been keeping alive for an hour and a half. So were the pilots sealed in the cockpit. Lieutenant Johnson's assessment was direct. Maynard Smith alone was responsible for the survival of the aircraft, and everyone still aboard it. The story of Snuffy Smith spread fast. A first-mission gunner, the one nobody wanted, had single-handedly held a burning aircraft together for 90 minutes while fighting off enemy fighters with one hand and a fire with the other. On July 15, 1943, Secretary of War Henry Stimson flew to England specifically to present the Medal of Honor to Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith, the first such award ever given to an enlisted airman, the first awarded to a living recipient in the entire European theater. A ceremony was arranged at Thurleigh. Press was invited. Officers assembled. There was one problem. They could not find Snuffy Smith. A search swept through the barracks, the mess hall, the flight line. Nothing. Finally, someone checked the kitchen. There he was, Medal of Honor recipient, standing over a pile of potatoes with a peeler in his hand. He'd been assigned to KP duty, kitchen patrol, as punishment for returning late from a pass. He had completely forgotten about the ceremony. They pulled him out of the kitchen, cleaned him up, and rushed him to the podium. Secretary Stimson placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. That was Snuffy Smith. Smith flew 4 more combat missions after receiving the medal, but the strain had accumulated. The Army diagnosed him with what they called operational exhaustion, what we now recognize as combat stress. He was grounded permanently. And then he went right back to being Snuffy Smith. He began signing his letters with MH, his medal's initials, after his name, the way British officers use their decorations. He used his hero status to skip duties, sleep in, and avoid work. He wore out his welcome in record time. On December 17, 1944, Maynard Smith was reduced in rank from Staff Sergeant to Private for poor job performance. A Medal of Honor recipient, demoted. It almost never happens. He was sent home in early 1945 and discharged that May. His hometown gave him a parade anyway. America wanted heroes, and Snuffy Smith had genuinely been one. Post-war life was turbulent. Legal problems, failed business ventures, a second marriage to a British woman named Mary he'd met in England, and 4 children. He worked for the Treasury Department again, founded a magazine, bounced from one thing to the next. He never quite found solid ground. But he never denied what he had done on May 1st, 1943. Sometimes he embellished it. That was Snuffy. Maynard Harrison Smith died on May 11, 1984, in St. Petersburg, Florida. He was 72 years old. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Let's be clear about what Snuffy Smith did that day. For 90 minutes, at 20,000 feet, with no help and no reinforcements, he fought a fuel-fed fire threatening to destroy the aircraft, kept a critically wounded crewman alive, manned 2 separate machine guns to hold off attacking fighters, threw live ammunition overboard before it could kill him, beaded flames with his bare hands, and used every resource available to him, including himself, to keep that aircraft in the air. He was on his first combat mission. He had no experience. 3 of his crewmates had already bailed out. The B-17 landed with over 3,500 holes in it. It snapped in half on the runway, and everyone still aboard walked away. Snuffy Smith was not a noble figure. He was difficult, arrogant, and frequently his own worst enemy. He spent his whole military career breaking rules and alienating people. But on that one morning, when a burning aircraft needed exactly one person to refuse to give up, Maynard Smith was that person. Heroism doesn't care about your personality. It doesn't check your record. It only asks one question. What do you do when everything falls apart? The soldier nobody wanted to fly with saved every single person who flew with him. And then he went back to peeling potatoes.